The date is Sunday, January 22nd, 1905. The city is St. Petersburg, the heart of the vast Russian Empire. A bitter cold hangs in the air, and the streets are covered in a thick blanket of snow. Through this frozen landscape, a river of humanity is flowing. Tens of thousands of people are on the move. They are factory workers, their wives walking beside them, their children holding their hands. They are dressed in their Sunday best. In their hands they carry religious icons, golden and gleaming in the winter light. Alongside the images of saints they hold aloft portraits of their emperor, Tsar Nicholas II. To them, he is more than a ruler, he is their protector, their intercessor with God on earth, their little father. At the head of this massive, peaceful procession is a charismatic and conflicted figure, a 35-year-old Orthodox priest named Father Georgy Gapon. It was Gapon who had organized the factory workers of the capital, and it was Gapon who convinced them that their salvation lay in a direct appeal to the Tsar himself. He believed, as did the thousands who followed him, in the fundamental goodness of the Tsar. He believed that the people's suffering, the grueling 16-hour workdays, the pitiful wages, the unsafe and squalid conditions, was the fault of corrupt ministers and greedy factory owners who shielded the Tsar from the truth. If they could only reach him, if they could only present their case directly, he would surely listen. He would surely act. Their destination was the magnificent Winter Palace, the Tsar's official residence on the banks of the Neva River. Their goal was simple: to personally deliver a petition to their emperor. It was a document born of desperation, pleading for justice and a measure of human dignity. It asked for an 8-hour day, the right to form unions, and a living wage. It begged for an end to a disastrous war with Japan that had brought only humiliation and economic ruin. The marchers truly believed that the Tsar, their little father, would receive their petition, listen to their pleas, and grant them relief. They were his children, after all, and they were walking towards his home to ask for his help. This episode tells the story of that day. It is the story of how a hopeful religious procession, an act of faith in an ancient system of absolute rule, descended into a horrific massacre. This was the day that would become known to history as Bloody Sunday, the day the sacred bond between the Tsar and his subjects was shattered. It was the day the Russian people's faith in their little father died in the snow, and the long, violent road to revolution truly began. Part 1. The Gathering Storm. Russia at a breaking point. Turn of the century, Russia was a nation of contradictions. It was a vast, powerful empire on the world stage, yet for the vast majority of its people, life was a desperate struggle. This was especially true in the industrial centers like St. Petersburg. In the decades leading up to 1905, peasants had poured in from the countryside, drawn by the promise of work in the city's booming factories and mills. What they found was not a new life, but a new kind of hardship. The industrial workforce of St. Petersburg was a population living on the edge. The average workday was 11.5 hours, but it could stretch to 15 or 16 hours during peak times. The work itself was often brutal and dangerous. Safety regulations were non-existent. Workers lost limbs in unguarded machinery, their lungs filled with toxic fumes and metal dust. There was no compensation for injury, no sick pay. A worker who got hurt or fell ill was simply fired, cast out to fend for themselves. Wages were so low that an entire family could barely survive, even with women and children also working in the factories for a fraction of a man's pay. Their lives outside the factory walls were just as grim. Families were crammed into squalid tenements, often with multiple families sharing a single cold, damp room. Sanitation was poor, and diseases like typhus and cholera were rampant. For these people, there was no safety net. There was only the endless cycle of exhausting work, hunger, and the constant threat of destitution. They were trapped, with little power to change their circumstances. Strikes were illegal, and unions were outlawed, viewed by the state as revolutionary organizations. Any attempt to organize for better conditions was met with swift and brutal suppression by the police or the feared Cossack cavalry. Onto this mountain of domestic misery, another heavy burden was added in 1904. The Russo-Japanese War. On paper, it should have been an easy victory for the mighty Russian Empire against the small island nation of Japan. Instead, It was a national humiliation. The war was fought over competing imperial ambitions in Manchuria and Korea. The Tsar's government, led by figures like the aggressively confident Interior Minister Vyacheslav von Plehve, believed a short, victorious war would quell rising discontent at home and boost national pride. They could not have been more wrong. The conflict was a disaster from the start. The supposedly invincible Russian army suffered a series of shocking defeats on land. The world watched in disbelief as the Russian Pacific Fleet was bottled up and destroyed at Port Arthur. In a desperate final gamble, Russia sent its Baltic Fleet on an epic 7-month journey around the world to turn the tide of the war. In May of 1905, it would finally arrive, only to be utterly annihilated by the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Tsushima in one of the most decisive naval battles in history. The war crippled the Russian economy, food prices soared, and factories losing military contracts began to lay off workers. For the people of St. Petersburg, the war was a source of inflation that made their meager bread rations more expensive, and a cause of job losses that pushed their families closer to starvation. It exposed the government as incompetent, corrupt, and dangerously out of touch. At the very top of this rigid, teetering structure sat the Tsar himself, Nicholas II. Nicholas was not an evil man, but he was tragically unsuited for the role he inherited. He was, by nature, a private, gentle man, deeply devoted to his wife, the Empress Alexandra, and their children. He was far more comfortable at home with his family than he was in the grand halls of power, wrestling with the immense problems of his empire. He had become Tsar in 1894 after the sudden death of his imposing father, Alexander III. Alexander had been a powerful, intimidating autocrat who ruled Russia with an iron fist. He believed that any form of democracy or constitutional limit on his power was a poison that would destroy the country. Nicholas inherited this belief without question. He saw autocracy, the absolute, unchecked power of the Tsar, as a sacred, God-given duty. It was his personal responsibility to preserve this power and pass it on, undiminished, to his son. He was deeply religious and truly believed that he was answerable only to God for the well-being of his people, but he was also isolated. He and his family lived in a gilded bubble, spending most of their time in their palaces outside the capital. The information he received about his empire was heavily filtered by his ministers and the court nobility, who told him what they thought he wanted to hear. He had almost no direct contact with the common people. The peasants, the workers, the soldiers, he knew of their lives only through official reports and statistics. He genuinely believed he was the benevolent little father to his people, and that they, in turn, revered him with unshakable loyalty and love. This profound misunderstanding was the foundation upon which the coming tragedy would be built. Into this tense and volatile environment stepped Father Georgy Gapon. Gapon was a complex and charismatic figure, a man of genuine contradictions. Born to a poor peasant family in Ukraine, he was intelligent and ambitious, and he had risen through the church to secure a post as a prison chaplain in St. Petersburg. There, he witnessed the suffering of the common people firsthand and developed a sincere desire to help them. He was a powerful and emotional public speaker, and he quickly gained a devoted following among the city's factory workers. But Gapon was also vain, and he enjoyed the influence he commanded. His path to power was an unusual one, born from a government strategy known as police unionism. The idea, pioneered by the Moscow police chief Sergei Zubatov, was to create official, government-sanctioned workers' organizations. The thinking was that if the state controlled the unions, it could satisfy the workers' basic economic and cultural needs, organizing meetings, lectures, and mutual aid funds while steering them away from the dangerous influence of radical socialist and Marxist revolutionaries. It was a strategy of containment. In 1904, after Zubatov's ideas fell out of favor, Father Gapon received permission from the authorities to establish his own organization in St. Petersburg, the Assembly of Russian Factory and Mill Workers. The government and the new Interior Minister Prince Sviatopolk Mirsky saw Gapon as a useful tool, a priest who could keep the workers loyal to the church and the Tsar, a safe alternative to revolution. For a time, the plan seemed to work. Gapon's assembly grew at an astonishing rate. By the end of 1904, it had 12 branches across the city and a membership of over 20,000 workers, far more than all the underground revolutionary parties combined. The government had made a critical miscalculation. They failed to understand that the workers' grievances were real and profound. Gapon may have been a tool for the state, but he also took the workers' problems to heart. He was riding a tiger, and he was about to lose control. The final, fatal spark was lit in December of 1904 at the massive Puchilov Ironworks, one of the largest factories in the city. The factory manager fired 4 workers. The reason for their dismissal was simple. They were all members of Father Gapon's assembly. This was a direct challenge to the organization and to Gapon's authority. The workers saw it as an attack on their only means of collective action. Gapon could not let this challenge stand. On behalf of the assembly, he went to the factory management to demand the reinstatement of the 4 men. He was rebuffed. He appealed to the city governor. He was ignored. The situation quickly escalated. The Putilov workers, seeing their union under threat, decided to act. On January 16, 1905, the entire Putilov plant, with its 12,000 workers, went on strike. The response from other factories was immediate and overwhelming. The Putilov strike acted like a magnet for all the pent-up frustration and desperation in the city. Within days, what had started as a dispute over 4 fired workers had snowballed into a massive general strike. Factory after factory shut down. Workers from the textile mills, the shipyards, and the steel plants all walked off their jobs in solidarity. By January 20th, the number of strikers in St. Petersburg had swelled to over 150,000. The city was paralyzed. There was no electricity, no public transport, and no newspapers. The capital of the Russian Empire had been brought to a standstill. Father Gapon was now at the head of a colossal and increasingly desperate movement. The strike was no longer just about the 4 Putilov men. It had become a vessel for every grievance the workers had. At mass meetings held at the assembly's branches, Gapon and his followers began to draft a list of their demands. It started with economic issues, the 8-hour day, higher wages, better working conditions. However, as the discussions continued, radical political demands, likely introduced by socialist intellectuals who had joined the movement, were added to the list. They called for freedom of speech and assembly. They demanded an end to the disastrous war. Most radical of all, they called for a constituent assembly, a parliament to be elected by all the people of Russia, which would effectively end the Tsar's absolute power. Gapon now faced a critical choice. The general strike could not last too long. The workers had no savings, and their families were already starving. He needed a way to bring the crisis to a head, to achieve a decisive victory. It was then that he conceived of his grand, audacious plan. He would bypass the corrupt officials and the heartless factory owners. He and all his followers would go directly to the top. They would stage a massive, peaceful and prayerful march to the Winter Palace and present their petition directly to the Tsar himself. He was convinced that Nicholas, their little father, would listen. He announced the plan to his followers. On the coming Sunday, they would all march together. They would bring their wives and their children. They would carry icons and portraits of the Tsar to show their peaceful intentions and their unwavering loyalty. It was to be a final, desperate appeal to the man they still believed was their ultimate protector. The stage was now set for the tragic confrontation that would change the course of Russian history. Part 2. A petition of hope and desperation. The heart of Father Gapon's audacious plan was the petition itself. The document that the workers intended to lay at the Tsar's feet was one of the most remarkable of the era, a mixture of humble, almost medieval appeal and a thoroughly modern, radical manifesto. In the days leading up to the march, its text was read aloud in the crowded, smoky halls of the assembly's branches across St. Petersburg. For the thousands of workers who listened, many of whom were illiterate, its words were a revelation. It gave voice to a lifetime of unspoken suffering and articulated a vision of a new Russia they had barely dared to dream of. The petition began with a tone of profound and desperate respect. It did not address Nicholas II as a political leader, but as a divinely appointed father figure. It began, "Sovereign, we, the workers and inhabitants of the city of St. Petersburg of various estates, our wives, our children, and our aged, helpless parents, have come to you, Sovereign, to seek justice and protection." It spoke of their misery and oppression, framing their plea as a supplication from loyal subjects to their rightful protector. "We have been beggared, We are oppressed, we are burdened with unbearable labor, we are insulted, we are not recognized as human beings, we are treated as slaves who must suffer their bitter fate in silence. From this heart-rending opening, the petition moved to a list of specific, immediate needs, the grievances that had fueled the Putilov strike in the first place. First and foremost were the economic demands. It called for the immediate establishment of an 8-hour workday. It demanded a minimum wage of 1 ruble per day, a modest sum, but one that represented a significant improvement for many. It asked for an end to forced overtime and for the creation of factory floor commissions, jointly run by workers and management to resolve disputes. It insisted on better medical care and demanded that the workshops be improved so that they were not, in the petition's own stark words, places of death. These were the practical, bread-and-butter issues that had pushed the workers to the breaking point. The document did not stop there. It seamlessly transitioned from the factory floor to the structure of the Russian state. Its authors, likely with the help of socialist intellectuals who had attached themselves to Gapon's movement, understood that economic justice was impossible without political freedom. The petition laid out a breathtaking series of political demands that struck at the heart of the Tsar's autocratic rule. It called for inviolability of the person, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of conscience in matters of religion. It demanded universal and compulsory primary education paid for by the state. It insisted that the Tsar's ministers be made responsible to the people, not just to the Tsar himself. Then came the two most explosive points. The petition demanded an immediate end to the ruinous war with Japan, a conflict the workers blamed for much of their economic misery. Finally, its most radical clause of all, it called for the election of a constituent assembly. This was to be a national parliament, a Russian Duma, elected by a universal, secret and equal ballot for all citizens, without exception. This single demand, hidden amongst the pleas for better wages and shorter hours, was pure revolution. A constituent assembly would mean the end of autocracy. It would transform the Tsar from an absolute ruler, answerable only to God, into a constitutional monarch, bound by the will of his people as expressed through their elected representatives. After each reading of the petition in the assembly halls, thousands upon thousands of workers came forward to add their names, or, for those who could not write, their thumbprints. Over 135,000 signatures were collected. This was now their document, their collective voice. While the workers debated the words of their petition, Father Gapon worked tirelessly to orchestrate the march itself. He was a master of political theatre, and he understood the power of symbolism. He gave his followers a strict set of instructions for the coming Sunday. His plan was designed to present an undeniable image of peaceful, loyal, and devout subjects seeking an audience with their sovereign. First, he commanded, the march must be absolutely peaceful. No one was to carry a weapon. No one was to shout angry slogans or make threats. They were to come in their Sunday best, the cleanest and most dignified clothes they owned. This was to be a solemn occasion, not a riot. Second, he told them to bring their entire families. Their wives and children were to march alongside them. This was a masterstroke of strategy. Gapon believed, perhaps naively, that the Tsar's soldiers would never fire on a crowd that included women and children. Their presence was a living testament to the peaceful intentions of the procession. Finally, and most importantly, he instructed them to carry religious icons and portraits of the Tsar. This would transform the march from a political protest into something resembling a religious crusade. The icons of Christ and the Virgin Mary would show their piety and their faith in God's justice. The portraits of Nicholas II would demonstrate their unwavering loyalty. They were not marching against the Tsar, they were marching to the Tsar. The revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, watched Gapon's preparations with a mixture of scorn and alarm. They saw him as a charlatan, a police stooge leading the workers into a trap. They warned anyone who would listen that the little father would greet them with bullets. The workers, however, did not listen. Their faith was in Father Gapon and the Tsar. Gapon himself seemed to be caught up in the messianic fervor of the moment. He truly believed he was on a divine mission. On Saturday, the day before the march, he sent a final, impassioned letter directly to the Tsar. "Sovereign," he wrote, "do not fear. Come out tomorrow to your people. I, the representative of the working men and my comrades, guarantee the inviolability of your person." He also sent copies of the petition to the Tsar's ministers, including the Minister of the Interior, Prince Sviatopolk Mirsky. He was giving them fair warning. He was laying all his cards on the table. While the workers of St. Petersburg were preparing their souls for their sacred meeting, the Tsar's government was preparing for war. The capital was gripped by official panic. Gapon's letters and the news of a mass march on the Winter Palace were viewed by the authorities as an unprecedented threat to public order. They saw an army of 150,000 strikers, and they imagined a revolution was at their gates. The one man who could have diffused the entire situation, the one man the march was intended for, was not even there to receive them. Tsar Nicholas II was not at the Winter Palace. On the advice of his security chiefs, he and his family had left the capital for the relative safety of their palace at Tsarskoye Selo, a town about 15 miles to the south. The decision perfectly encapsulated his style of rule. He was not personally ordering a crackdown, he was simply making himself absent, removing himself from the crisis and leaving it in the hands of his subordinates. He remained detached, insulated from the storm that was about to break over his capital. With the Tsar gone, the responsibility fell to his ministers. On the evening of Saturday, January 21st, a frantic and indecisive meeting was held. The Minister of the Interior, Prince Sviatopolk Mirsky, a man who had a reputation as a reformer, was paralyzed. He had initially allowed Gapon's assembly to operate, hoping it would act as a safety valve for discontent. Now, that valve was about to explode. He and the other officials had read the petition. They saw its radical political demands, especially the call for a constituent assembly, as sedition. In their minds, there could be no negotiation. Gapon had stopped being a useful tool, he was now a dangerous revolutionary. The decision was made, the workers would not be allowed to reach the Winter Palace, the procession was to be stopped, by force if necessary. That night, the city was transformed into an armed camp. The government's orders were swift and decisive. More than 12,000 troops were brought into the city and stationed at strategic points. Imperial guards, hardened infantry regiments, and the feared Cossacks on their swift horses were deployed. They created a series of military cordons, blocking the key bridges and main avenues that the workers would need to use to get from their outlying industrial suburbs to the city center. The plan was to isolate the different columns of marchers and disperse them long before they could converge on Palace Square. Public notices were hastily printed and posted, warning people not to assemble and stating that the authorities would use force to maintain order. But it was too little, too late. The vast majority of the workers, caught up in the excitement of the march, never saw the warnings. They went to their beds on Saturday night, dreaming of their meeting with the Tsar. They had no idea that the palace was empty and that the streets leading to it were now lined with thousands of soldiers who had been given clear orders to stop them. A tragedy of miscalculation, misunderstanding, and abdicated responsibility was now inevitable. Part 3. The Massacre, From Petition to Bloodshed. Sunday, January 22nd, 1905, dawned quiet and frozen over St. Petersburg. In the working-class districts on the city's outskirts, there was a palpable sense of nervous anticipation. Families woke before dawn, dressed in their finest, most threadbare clothes, and ate what little food they had. Then, as the weak winter sun began to rise, they gathered. From the industrial Vyborg district in the north, from the shipyards of the Neva district in the southeast, and from the massive factory complexes southwest of the city, the people began to move. Father Gapon's plan called for separate columns, each starting from a local branch of his assembly, to march from different directions and converge as one great river of humanity in Palace Square, directly in front of the Winter Palace. The largest of these columns, numbering in the tens of thousands, formed near the Putilov ironworks. At its head was Father Gapon himself. He was dressed in his priestly vestments, a large crucifix held high in his hand. Surrounded by his closest lieutenants and flanked by followers carrying large portraits of the Tsar and Tsarina, he projected an aura of absolute confidence and divine purpose. The mood of the crowd was solemn, hopeful, almost festive. They sang hymns, their voices rising in the frigid air. They were a congregation on a pilgrimage, walking to see their little father. As Gapon's column made its way toward the city center, their path took them to the Narva Triumphal Arch, a massive stone gateway built to celebrate Tsar Alexander I's victory over Napoleon. It was a grand symbol of imperial power, and it was here that the procession came to its first, terrifying halt. Blocking the road beneath the arch was a solid, silent wall of soldiers. 2 companies of the Preobrazhensky Guard, an elite infantry regiment, stood in neat lines, their bayoneted rifles held ready. Behind them, a squadron of Cossacks sat ominously on their horses, their long lances held upright. The marchers slowed, their hymns faltering into a confused murmur. They could not comprehend what they were seeing. These were the Tsar's soldiers. They were there to protect the Tsar and, by extension, his people. The crowd truly believed the soldiers were simply there for crowd control, a formality before they would be allowed to pass. They pressed forward, their faith unshaken. An officer on horseback rode out and ordered the crowd to disperse. His voice was lost in the vastness of the procession. The people continued to advance slowly, certain that this was all a misunderstanding. Suddenly, a bugle cut through the cold air. It was a sharp, piercing sound. On this signal, the squadron of Cossacks spurred their horses forward, charging with the flats of their sabers and their heavy leather whips. Their goal was to break the crowd's momentum and send them fleeing in panic. The front ranks of the procession buckled under the charge. People screamed and fell, trampled in the snow. The sheer density of the crowd was too great. It was like a living wall. The cavalry charge faltered, unable to penetrate the mass of humanity. The procession, though shocked and bruised, reformed its lines. Their determination was hardened, not broken. Father Gapon, his face pale but resolute, shouted, "Freedom or death!" and urged them forward once more. The infantry officers gave another warning. A second bugle call, and the front rank of soldiers raised their rifles. A volley of shots cracked through the air. They had fired over the heads of the crowd. It was a final warning shot, a last attempt to frighten them into retreat. It had the opposite effect. The people, seeing that no one was hit, became convinced that the soldiers were firing blanks. They thought it was all a scare tactic. They believed the soldiers, their brothers, would never shoot them. A wave of relief, even joy, passed through the front ranks. They were certain now that they would be allowed to pass. They picked up their fallen icons and banners and once again began to walk forward, their pace quickening, their voices rising in renewed hymns. They were walking directly toward the leveled rifles of the Imperial Guard. Then the bugle sounded again. The soldiers lowered their aim. There was a second, ear-splitting volley. This time, they did not fire into the air. The front ranks of the procession collapsed as if struck by a giant, invisible scythe. The sound of the rifles was instantly replaced by a sound of collective, human agony. Fathers fell on top of their children. Banners and icons tumbled into the blood-stained snow. Another volley followed, and another. There was no escape. The soldiers were firing methodically, directly into the dense, panicked mass of unarmed people. The procession, which moments before had been a river of hope, was now a chaotic slaughterhouse. People screamed, turned, and ran, trampling the dead and wounded in their desperate flight. Official reports would later claim around 130 people were killed that day across the city. The real number was almost certainly closer to 1,000, with many thousands more wounded. The horror at the Narva Gate was a strategy, repeated across the city. On the Troitsky Bridge, another large column of workers marching from the Vyborg district was met by the Pavlovsky lifeguards. After a brief standoff, the soldiers opened fire, sending bodies tumbling onto the frozen surface of the Neva River below. Near the Alexander Garden, just a stone's throw from the Winter Palace itself, soldiers who had been hiding in position fired without warning into another group of marchers. On the city's main thoroughfare, Nevsky Prospect, panicked crowds, including onlookers and passers-by who had no part in the march, were caught in the crossfire as Cossacks charged and troops fired down the street. The government's plan had worked. No one reached Palace Square. The city center was secured. But the cost was a massacre of the Tsar's own people, in his own capital, on the doorstep of his own home. In the chaos of the Narva Gate, Father Gapon had fallen to the ground as the first volley hit. He was unhurt, but all around him were the bodies of the people he had led. He was in a state of profound shock, his mind unable to process the carnage. He was pulled to his feet by a man marching nearby, a socialist revolutionary named Pinhas Rutenberg, who had joined Gapon's movement to observe it. Rutenberg dragged the dazed priest through the fleeing crowds into a side street, and eventually to the safety of a nearby apartment belonging to the writer Alexei Gorky. There, they cut off Gapon's long priest's hair and dressed him in workman's clothes to disguise him from the police. For hours, Gapon was like a man in a trance. The faith that had defined his entire life, his belief in the sacred bond between the Tsar and his people, had been utterly and irrevocably destroyed in the space of a few minutes. The little father had not protected his children. He had allowed them to be slaughtered. As evening fell, Gapon, now a changed man, stood before a small gathering of workers in the safe house. His face was a mask of grief and fury. The man who that morning had carried a crucifix and preached faith in the Tsar now delivered a new, terrible sermon. His voice filled with a cold rage, he pronounced a curse on the Tsar and all his kin. Then he uttered the words that would echo through the coming revolution. He declared, "There is no God any longer. There is no Tsar." It was a cry of personal anguish, but it was also a political epitaph. On Bloody Sunday, the centuries-old myth of the benevolent, God-given Tsar died. In its place, something new and terrible was born. Part 4. The Aftermath. A revolution begins. The last shots of Bloody Sunday faded as dusk fell over St. Petersburg, but they were replaced by a new, more ominous sound, the roar of a nation's fury. The news of the massacre exploded across the vast Russian Empire like a shockwave. What had happened in the capital was a profound betrayal. The Tsar, the little father, had not just failed to protect his children, he had ordered them shot down in the street while they carried his portrait. The sacred myth that had bound the Russian people to their monarch for centuries was shattered in a single afternoon. In St. Petersburg itself, the reaction was immediate and violent. The shock of the massacre gave way to a burning rage. That night, workers began tearing down telegraph poles and ripping up paving stones to build barricades. They armed themselves with tools from their factories, with pieces of scrap iron, with anything they could find. The city that had woken with hymns on its lips went to sleep to the sound of sporadic gunfire and revolutionary songs. The character of the struggle had changed instantly. There would be no more peaceful petitions. The fight was now for survival and for vengeance. The government's brutal display of force, intended to crush the strike and restore order, had achieved the exact opposite. It had ignited a firestorm. The news, carried by telegraph and word of mouth, electrified the empire. In Moscow, Warsaw, Riga, and across the industrial heartlands, workers walked out of their factories in a massive wave of sympathy strikes. The unrest was extended beyond the industrial working class. University students across the country boycotted lectures and held fiery political rallies. Professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers formed their own unions, demanding a complete political overhaul. The liberal middle classes, who had long chafed under the Tsar's autocratic rule, saw their moment. They formed a political alliance called the Union of Unions and demanded a constitution and a representative government. The spirit of rebellion spread to the countryside, where the vast majority of Russia's population lived. Peasants, hearing of the slaughter in the capital, saw it as a sign that the Tsar's authority was crumbling. They began to seize the estates of the nobility, burning manor houses and redistributing land amongst themselves. Even the pillars of the Tsar's power, the military, began to crack. The disastrous war with Japan had already destroyed morale. Now, soldiers and sailors, most of whom were peasants and workers themselves, began to question their loyalty. In June of 1905, the crew of the battleship Potemkin, the most powerful warship in the Black Sea Fleet, mutinied over being served rotten meat. They killed their officers, raised the red flag of revolution, and sailed the warship into the port of Odessa, a city already paralyzed by a general strike. The Potemkin mutiny was a terrifying symbol for the regime. The revolution was now inside the barracks and on the naval decks. For Tsar Nicholas II, secluded in his palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the events of 1905 were a bewildering and infuriating nightmare. In his personal diary, he recorded his thoughts on Bloody Sunday. He wrote, "A painful day. In St. Petersburg, there have been serious disorders. The troops had to fire in different parts of the city. Lord, how painful and sad. His words reveal his complete detachment from the reality of the situation. He did not see a massacre of his own people. He saw disorders caused by ill-intentioned people. He believed the workers had been duped by revolutionaries and that firm action was necessary. He had no concept of the profound wound he had inflicted upon the nation's psyche. As the year wore on, however, the crisis became impossible to ignore. The humiliating defeat in the war against Japan was finalized with the Treaty of Portsmouth in September. The country was in a state of near anarchy. A massive nationwide general strike in October paralyzed the entire country, shutting down railways, the postal service, and the government itself. Russia was grinding to a halt. Nicholas was finally cornered. He had to listen to the one man he disliked and distrusted, but who was also perhaps his most capable minister, Sergei Witte. Witte was a pragmatic and talented administrator who had overseen Russia's industrialization. He laid out the Tsar's options in the starkest possible terms. He told Nicholas he had two choices: either impose a ruthless military dictatorship and drown the entire country in blood, or make significant political concessions. For Nicholas, both options were abhorrent. A military dictatorship might fail, and a constitution was a betrayal of everything he stood for. He believed that to limit his own power was to violate his sacred coronation oath to uphold the autocracy. He agonized over the decision, but the pressure was immense. Even his own mother, the Dowager Empress, urged him to compromise. Finally, with extreme reluctance, he gave in. On October 30th, 1905, the Tsar signed what became known as the October Manifesto. The document, drafted by Sergei Witte, was revolutionary. It granted the Russian people fundamental civil liberties, freedom of conscience, speech, assembly, and association. It promised to expand voting rights. Most critically, it created a new, elected national legislature, the State Duma. The manifesto explicitly stated that no law could become effective without the Duma's consent. On paper, it was the end of absolute rule in Russia. The autocracy was dead. When the manifesto was published, it was met with scenes of wild jubilation in the streets. People wept, cheered, and waved red flags. It seemed that the martyrs of Bloody Sunday had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had won the people their freedom. But the victory was an illusion. Nicholas II hated the manifesto and everything it represented. He saw it as a temporary concession, a strategic retreat forced upon him by chaos. He never had any intention of honoring its spirit. In the months that followed, while the revolutionary fervor began to cool, the Tsar and his government began to claw back the power they had surrendered. Before the First Duma could even meet in 1906, Nicholas issued the fundamental laws, which reasserted his own supreme power. He retained the title of autocrat. He kept full control over the military, foreign policy, and the appointment of ministers. He gave himself the power to dissolve the Duma at will, and to rule by emergency decree when it was not in session. The first Duma that was elected was full of liberal and reform-minded deputies who genuinely wanted to work for a new Russia. They demanded land reform and true democratic accountability. After just 73 days, the Tsar dissolved it. A second Duma was elected in 1907. It was even more radical than the first. It lasted just over 3 months before Nicholas dissolved it as well. He then illegally changed the election laws, disenfranchising huge numbers of workers and peasants to ensure that future Duma would be dominated by conservative, land-owning nobles who would do his bidding. The promise of the October Manifesto was a lie. The 1905 revolution was eventually crushed. The government used brutal force to restore order, executing thousands and sending tens of thousands more into exile in Siberia, but something had fundamentally and permanently changed. Bloody Sunday and the revolution it unleashed served as what Vladimir Lenin would later call the Great Dress Rehearsal for 1917. It taught the revolutionaries invaluable lessons. It proved that the workers were a powerful force, capable of paralyzing the entire state. It also taught them that the Tsarist regime could not be reformed or reasoned with. It would not give up power willingly, it only understood violence. The memory of the Tsar's soldiers firing on unarmed men, women, and children carrying his own portrait became a founding myth for the revolutionary movement. The story was told and retold, a brutal reminder that the bond of trust was gone. The 12 years that followed were merely a long, tense ceasefire. The fuse that was lit on Bloody Sunday was burning more slowly, sizzling its way toward the final cataclysmic explosion that would consume the Tsar, his family, and the entirety of Imperial Russia. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.